Are you ready to take your business to the next level? Every day there are countless books and articles that are published offering the key on how to make your business a success. It's easy to feel overwhelmed trying to keep up and run your business. That's why Deb Creer created the Business Power Hour. Keep up on the latest trends, best practices, and techniques for how to make your business a success. Let the Business Power Hour do the heavy work for you.
Good morning, good morning. I am Deb Creer, and I am passionate about giving professionals the tools that they need to make themselves and their businesses as successful as possible. And I am so excited about my guest today. We've had artists on before because, they have their own businesses. They are their own business, all sorts of things. But this young lady today is not only an artist, she is very much involved in knowing why we need to bring the arts and creativity and all of those things into the business world. And so please join me in welcoming Dr. Tasha Golden to our program today. Welcome, Dr. Golden. How are you doing?
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me, Deb. It's good to be here.
Great. Well, let me tell people just a little bit about you, and then we'll jump into this. So Dr. Tasha Golden is a singer, songwriter, turned behavioral scientist, and a leading expert in creativity, leadership, and change. She has spoken and consulted for little companies like Google, the Mayo Clinic, the U.S. Conference of Mayors, South by Southwest, and POLITICO, among many others, helping leaders and organizations link science and creative practice to drive innovation and growth. Dr. Golden was the first director of research for the International Arts and Mind Lab at Johns Hopkins School of Medicine. She is the adjacent faculty in the University of Florida's Center for Arts in Medicine and is the lead author of Arts on Prescription, a field guide for U.S. communities. Named as one of Fierce Pharma's Fierce 50 for innovative work integrating arts and health, she publishes regularly in Psychology Today, and her research has been featured in The Guardian, NPQ, and the CBC. So again, Dr. Golden, welcome.
Thank you so much.
Well, you have had quite the life. So tell us a little bit more about what brought you to where you are today.
Oh, well, this definitely was not the career plan that I had in mind when I was a young person trying to dream about my life. When I was a little girl, all that I wanted in the world was to write songs and travel the world and perform them. That was my dream career. And I got to do that for a lot of years. Got to work with amazing musicians, had songs and TV and film, and loved that work. But a couple things happened that wound up changing the trajectory of my career. The first is that I had songs about difficult experiences, like my own history of depression, my family's history of domestic violence. And everywhere we went in the world, those were always the songs that people stayed after concerts wanting to talk about. And they would share their own really personal stories of whether it was abuse histories, suicide ideation, things like that. And many of those people followed up their story by saying that I'm the first person they had ever told. And that was always such an honor to me, but it also made me highly aware, like, oh, if I'm the first person they'd ever told, that means they've never told a doctor or a therapist, not
A
even
parent, a loved one.
partner, right? Yeah. And so I got really curious about, okay, what is it about music or about the music venue or about me as a singer, like this different kind of role or character in this person's life that's making these things speakable for the first time. And then the other thing that happened in my career was that I hit a wall of catastrophic burnout and major depression. And I have this in common with, I'm sure, many of your listeners who have faced crises of many different kinds in their career. And I couldn't get out of bed for weeks, let alone play shows. And I knew that I wasn't going to be able to go back to the same touring life that I had had. And I had to reimagine what I was doing on the planet, who I was. If I'm not a singer-songwriter, this thing that I'd wanted to do since I was so young, what was I going to be? I didn't know if I wanted a future. And in that moment, I think I realized that one of the reasons that led to my work now, I realized that I had had a story about my life, that I'm a singer-songwriter and a music career is what I do to reach fulfillment. And as creative as I had always been as an artist, as a musician, as a writer, I had never learned to be creative about my own life.
Okay.
I had one story. And so in that time, I had to learn to get creative about who I was, not just creative in my craft, but creative about what I think identity is and what I think that I can do in the world. And I kept coming back to that experience of people sharing things after shows and just got so curious. And I followed the threads of these questions until I wound up, with a PhD in public health and behavioral sciences, but really focused on the roles of creativity and culture in our well-being and how we communicate, and especially how we imagine that things can be other than they are right now.
Right. And gosh, as we record this, the world is in turmoil, right? Let's just, that's the light way to put it. And I've known through my own health journeys and things like that, sometimes the easiest way to feel better is music or comedy or something where your brain goes, oh, okay. So talk to us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, there's something that we intuit where we tend to, you might even say, like, self-medicate with music. When we're feeling low, just to your point, we might put on an upbeat song, or when we need to cry, we might put on music that helps us to release those emotions. When we need to get some work done around the house, we might put on something upbeat to kind of like motivate us. We know that these things have an influence on us. And then, so there's kind of like this immediate affective change that we intuit and that we experience. And then there's also these more nuanced effects of the arts, in that they make us feel a little bit less alone, a little more connected. We see our lives reflected back to us in really great stand-up comedy, right? Like, oh, this experience that we've had has just been articulated in a new way that lets us see it anew and kind of and laugh at ourselves or laugh at the world in a different way. And so we know that I often say that humans evolved to make and share art for a reason. It didn't do anything for us.
Man drew on the caves. They were telling the stories.
Yeah. And if we didn't need this for our survival, like literally for our survival,
Right.
we would have stopped doing it millennia ago. And so the nice thing is that we don't have to know exactly why. What are the ins and outs behind why humans do this? We don't have to know all of that to be able to intuit that these can be beneficial to us. But a fun thing is that we do know more and more from the science now about how these things affect us, how they affect our brains, our social connections, the ways that we work and focus or don't. And so it's fun to see the science linking up to what many of us have intuited very naturally.
Right. And to me, and this is purely anecdotal, it does seem that it's worldwide. It's all humans that, they sing, all of these various things. So it's not something that's based in, a specific region. Now, obviously it might change a bit based on the region, but is it a worldwide phenomenon?
Sure. It's very different across cultures and backgrounds, and what's very soothing to one person might be really triggering to somebody else. So all of these things they're very cultural, and they can be very personal. But there's also interesting studies indicating that, across really different musical cultures and expressions, they asked people from all over the world, can you identify the lullaby in this selection? Can you identify the dance tune in this selection? And most people were correct, even when the lullaby sounded very different from their culture's lullabies, and so on. And so we do see that there's some elements, maybe not of universality, but of connection and understanding. We can kind of sense what's being communicated in music, even when it's not our language.
Right.
It's very interesting.
Right. And it obviously helps set the mood for whatever it is. You're very experienced in it because of your work in the film industry. Just think if we had TV shows, movies, whatever, with no soundtrack. Now, there are some that have that because for dramatic effect, right? But yeah, sometimes the only thing that we remember from movies and things or can name immediately, right? Dun, 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 right? Okay, that shark's going to get us or whatever it is. And so that music helps tie it all together. And it really does set that mood. The shark's going to get you. Oh, it's a lullaby. Oh, it's love story, right?
Mm.
And so, there is all of that.
Yeah, and what I think is so fascinating is to help people bridge oftentimes the gap between what we understand really naturally from exactly what you're talking about, film, that we know that the music sets you up. Like you can watch you've seen people like mash up a scene from a comedy, but they put scary music to it, and then suddenly it feels very scary or
Right.
foreboding. We know that the soundtrack, the things that we're listening to affect our emotions and affect what we're perceiving in a given thing in front of us. Yet, we don't typically apply that same thing to our everyday
Right.
lives. And it's very interesting in my work now, consulting with all kinds of different organizations, including on things like workplace well-being. It's very interesting to help step back and be like, what is it that people are hearing throughout the day or not hearing? And how is that affecting what they're able to perceive and think, how they're able to connect or not
Right.
with one another, with their clients, things like that. These are things that we can do studies of, but also enhance given what we know about the environment,
Right.
aesthetics, and sound.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting. I usually have some background noise, TV, music, whatever, and I always have. I mean, that's just I don't know why. It just seems more natural to me. And I remember one time long ago, I was in big corporate America, right there, and they were very serious. They were many of them were former military, so they were
Mhm.
very serious people, right? And in my little space of the world, I had walls. It wasn't like I was, bothering people with a cubicle and things. And I just always had music playing very softly. Unless you were in my office, you didn't hear it. And it bothered somebody. He just
Mm.
didn't like it. And he came in and he told me that he knew that I had that on because I had low self-esteem. And I
Oh,
looked at him and
wow.
I said, "I don't think you've met me." But, I did find and now I did not turn it off. I mean, it was like, "Shoo, this is my space." Um, but I thought that was very I mean, this has been 30 years ago at least, and I still very vividly remember, clearly, that music bothered him, and,
Mhm.
and so there are people, like my husband, he does not like noise. And,
Mm.
things like that, and so it does help people with their mental processes.
Yes, and when we can recognize that this can be very personal and very customized, then
Mhm,
we start to get down some paths of really how you create in the workplace, to your example, how you create workplaces that can be responsive to each person's
mhm,
um not just their preferences, but how they actually operate. We see a lot of this with studies related to neurodivergence,
mhm.
and when we seek to accommodate the different ways that people's brains work in the workplace, everybody benefits, whether they would identify as neurodivergent or not. But the things that we do, and this is just an element of universal design, the things that you do for folks who have disabilities or whose brains and bodies function a little bit differently from the typical, so to speak,
Mhm,
norm,
mhm.
that winds up benefiting everybody. So
Right.
to your point, like there are people who really can't do with any noise. They really need silence. Okay, how can we accommodate that? And people who really can't process or don't want to process or just feel less motivated or engaged without a little bit of noise or music or something stimulating them. Okay, how can we accommodate that? There's so many solutions to this
Mhm,
to help
mhm,
even these
mhm.
folks to work together very well.
Right, right. So let's really explore that because you focus on workplace. I read off just a handful of the companies that you have worked with, very different industries, which goes to show that this is very cross-cultural, cross-industry, cross whatever. Is there something that really ties all of that together?
The main thing, yes, is that people need help being able to see their work in a new way.
Yeah.
And there's definitely my research related to how arts, aesthetics, design, sound, light, all these different kinds of things can affect our health and well-being and how we work. And then if you zoom out from that, there's the idea of how do you see the way that you're doing things as just one iteration, one possible way of doing things. I mentioned that I had been creative as a songwriter, but hadn't been creative about my own life. And that's really the primary thing that I help leaders and organizations with now is, okay, we tend to think, especially in the business world, we tend to think about creativity as like, oh, how can I get more creative about a certain the craft that I'm doing, a product, or maybe how can creativity, we can teach people lateral thinking and we'll be more innovative, and that's what's going to benefit us. And yes, that's all true. But I think what people have a harder time with is how do you get creative about who you even are, why you're even here, why are you even making this product? What do you think the goal is? How are you defining success? What would it mean to be creative about that, to establish a creative mindset? And across, to your point, across these different sectors and industries, some of the hardest things that people have, some of the hardest challenges that people face is how can I see the premises that I'm accepting in order to challenge those or maybe question them and decide whether, okay, do I actually agree with that premise? What are the assumptions that we're coming into our work with? I often compare it to, like imagine that somebody gifts you a toy castle, a little toy castle, and it's really cool. And it's made of Legos, but you don't realize that it's made of Legos. So you're just like, well, here's its toy castle. It is what it is. I like toy castles. I'm going to play with it. Maybe I'll make it cooler. I'll add a drawbridge or something like that, but it's just a toy castle. Whereas if somebody realized that that toy castle was made of Legos, they know, okay, I can either keep the toy castle or I can take it apart. And
it's going to be a transformer.
Yeah, it could be anything else, right? And that's oftentimes the way that I think about our lives and the different assumptions that we're making. Like, okay, maybe the problem that you've invited me to solve is itself something that we need to peel back. And is that even the problem here? What is this problem kind of, what premises and assumptions is this based on? So that idea of how do we get creative? And then sometimes in that process, what we can bring in from the research around arts, aesthetics, design is how do those elements, how does what we know about how those things affect our thinking and our connection and stuff like that, we can bring those in sometimes to help foster a more creative, more creative mindset. And then, of course, all of these organizations across sectors are interested in well-being and and retention and how you make people want to work for you and stay with you and stay focused and productive. And so we can use all of these things to help enhance that. But usually, if I'm honest, usually kind of from a sideways angle that people haven't considered yet, which is why it works. Usually I'm brought in by people who've heard all of the normal things and they contact me to tell them something they haven't heard before, or ask a question they haven't been asked before.
Well, and obviously they're very open to it because so many people are going to go, music, well, that's fluff. Ugh, or they just see, no, we're here to do X. We build X. What do you mean we have to be creative with it and our workplace makes a difference? And those people you're probably never gonna get through to. It's the people who recognize, okay, they're the ones singing in their car. They're the ones vacuuming to music. I mean, they already probably kind of have that and then come to the realization that, wow, what can we do in the workplace with this?
Yeah. And, I think to be really clear, I think a lot of times my work doesn't wind up involving the arts specifically at all. A considerable amount of it certainly does. But a lot of times it's less about whether people can recognize the value of music or visual arts or even design or things like that, but more, do you want a way to see your problems differently?
Right.
A lot of times when leaders are stuck, what I've noticed is that they have hit the walls of a story about themselves or their work, and they think they've hit the walls of reality. And so they're like, well, here, we're stuck. We can't get past this. We've hit a plateau, or we're having this certain kind of UX, and we need to get over that. And sort of like, I think that you're telling. So I come in not always to apply expressive arts situations or music or things like that, but more so to use skills of creative thinking to be like, oh, I think you might be asking the wrong question, or you're just missing a question that you haven't asked yet. And so with some clients, we do get to explore things around how a different design in their workplace would enhance focus and productivity. And it's some of the work that I got to explore with Google. And with a lot of clients, it's more like, how do we help you to get past the stuck point, or how do we help you reinvent what you think that you are? Because it's never one thing. You came into this with one story, but it's just one of the possible stories you could be telling.
And it's just a chapter.
Right.
And for so many people, and especially in the business environment, creative can be, well, what if we did it this way? What if we tried that? And I don't think they stop and think, well, that's being creative. That is.
Sure. Yeah.
And that's, and so it's about the culture. Do they encourage that? Or is it, you will do it this way, and this is the only way that you can do it? And, and of course, then you have the people that say, well, it's always worked. Okay. But maybe something would work better. you know and then I'm guessing there are things where that you look at, okay, what's your employee retention? Do you have a high turnover? There may be a reason for that. Are your competitors leaving you behind? Do you even know what AI means? I mean, all of those various things play into this to just have a more healthy workplace.
Yes, and just there's a lot of opportunity cost as well when people think that, in the business world, we often treat uncertainty as a problem,
Right.
or as the dreaded
A threat.
the thing that you're trying to avoid. Yeah. And in my world as a creative, and from the science the science that I conduct, like, what we know is that uncertainty is all that we have. And so you can either treat uncertainty as something to get over and avoid, or you can recognize that that's always an illusion. Every time you get over it or avoid it, you're just, that's an illusion. The fact that you've avoided anything, right? Because all as humans, all that we have is uncertainty. And so you can either choose to keep treating that as something to avoid, or you can choose to make friends with uncertainty. And, I often use an example of, like, to an artist, a blank canvas isn't a problem. Like, a blank canvas is uncertainty manifested, right? Like, who knows?
I'd be thinking, oh.
Right. And to an artist, it's like, the blank canvas isn't a problem. The blank canvas is the point. If there was no blank canvas, I wouldn't be able to paint anything. I guess you could paint on top of something else. But, like, speaking more like figuratively here. And so with leaders as well, part of my work is, like, what would it look like to understand that everything is always in flux, and to not see that as a problem, but to see, and that's part of taking the mindset of a creator, not necessarily of art or expressive activities, but a creator of your life, a creator of your organization, a creator of your success. What would it look like to take the mindset of a creator, that you are constantly creating your life? You're not just responding to it or sitting on it, even if it seems like you are. That's always an illusion. And so creatives and creative practices, even if you don't take up creative practices, they can offer really good examples of people who live in uncertainty and don't see it as a problem. Although we often do see it as hard. It is difficult, but it's just what existence is. And we're friends with it.
Right. And we have to see it as that opportunity. I was just thinking, I believe it was Da Vinci who said, he's not crafting something. He's bringing out of the marble what was already there. I think that was Da Vinci. And I think that's, we can think of that with our employees. What is there that we can bring out? And are they, the next great salesperson? Have they got the idea that's going to revolutionize your industry? Whatever it is, what can we bring out? It could just be that they're the person who's going to organize the cakes, the birthday cakes, right? Whatever it is, it must be time for me to eat. What can we do to bring that out of them?
Yeah, and there's there's so many ways to think of that, especially at the organizational level. People tend to think of, like you're talking about, like, drawing out talent, but there's also, how do you remove the barriers to that?
Right.
And
are they afraid to say, hey?
Yes, and what are they spending their cognitive powers on that they don't, that is keeping them from being able to pour that into the work that they're doing, that's keeping them from having the spark of a new idea. And that can come down to, like, the culture of your workplace. If people are constantly afraid of if the culture of your workplace is that overwork signals commitment, then people are just going to keep their head down.
Right.
And, I've done some studies of this with major, Fortune 50 companies, but, like, the culture of the workplace is that people need to perform productivity instead of optimizing it. You've created a culture where people have to look like they're busy, and they're scared to get caught, quote unquote, not being completely busy. But the science of, our physiology, we can only really work in focused work 3 to 4 hours a day, any one of us. We can do some extra things, like maybe reply to an email, but as far as, like, our focused, deep cognitive work, we've got about 3 to 4 hours a day, any one of us. And so just physiologically, seeing people take breaks out of your work should be like, oh, good, that person's about to like
Right.
optimize their productivity because they are giving themselves a break. But anyway, like, what are the things? Are people maybe being underpaid, and so they're worried about like, how am I going to make my rent? How am I going to pay this bill? Or my mother's sick or something like that. How are we going to take care of these things? If they didn't have to worry about that, what kind of executive function and cognitive power could they bring to their work here? And so when we think about, your metaphor of sculpting, when we think about removing the things that would leave the shining element there, part of that sometimes can be things that seem like boring administrative decisions, but they're not. It's kind of like, what are you expecting human beings to be able to do despite the reality of their lives that's existing all the time out here? And sometimes we can do a lot of really brilliant work when we take a different kind of look at the decisions that we think are just administrative, just setting some kind of like ground level for a bottom line that we're looking for. Oh no, it has many more effects than that.
Right. So one of the things that you work with when you're working with businesses is the framework called the creative mindset. So tell us more about that.
Oh, this was a framework to try to distill what I've seen in research and practice over time as far as, what does it look like to have a creative mindset? And like I said, a lot of people do think, oh, creativity is about being expressive. I'm not creative. It's funny, I've given talks to rooms full of entrepreneurs, and I'm like, who in here would identify as creative? And like maybe a third of the room raises their hand, and I'm like,
I don't even really would, right?
Yeah, y'all literally created a business, sometimes out of nothing. And it's fascinating to me that those people would not think of themselves as being creative. But of course, it's just kind of the way that we use that word in Western culture is often kind of focused on arts or IT things or whatever, or being expressive. And if people don't relate to that, then they don't think that they're creative. And so I was like, well, what is it that I've seen that is actually the creative mindset? And there's 3 pillars of the creative mindset that I've identified in my work. The first one is deconstruction. And this is an ability to see that everything around us is made up of decisions and pieces. Like nothing has come to us as fated, like F-A-T-E-D, or fixed. It's the ability to see the Legos in the toy castle, right? That like this could be something else. It is what it is right now, but it doesn't have to be that way. It wasn't inevitable. And that means that it could be different. Maybe not. Maybe I individually can't make it different, but it could be different. So am I able to see the world around me as one iteration of what could have been possible or is possible now? And that includes our personal lives. It includes our workplaces. It includes our industries. It includes our society, our politics, all of these kinds of things. So deconstruction, are you able to take apart what is right now in the sense that you can notice that it's made up of a lot of variables that could be put together differently? The second pillar of the creative mindset is imagination. Once you recognize that, once you have the Legos in front of you, can you imagine something else that they could be? Or does your brain just keep kind of putting it back together into a toy castle because that's all you've got? That's the template you got and that's all you know. Or are you able to imagine other ways that it could be? And this comes up, so much, as you can imagine, in business settings, that this is the way that we've always done it, or this is the way that everybody else has done it and they were successful. And so we're just going to follow that script. But can you imagine another way that it could work? And, along with that, there's all kinds of pieces of that. Like, can you tolerate the discomfort of not knowing if it'll work? Can you?
Yeah, I mean, that's the hard part. It's like, yeah.
Yes, exactly. And, part of both of those things I talk about in Psychology Today. I wrote an article called The Art of Refusal, but it's just about how the groundwork for all creativity is a refusal to accept things as they are.
I love that.
And that's applicable in the arts. If somebody like me is going to write a song, I can't write a song unless I refuse to believe that all of the songs have already been written. Unless I refuse to believe that I can't, I don't have any business trying to do that. Refusal is at the root of all creativity. And that's in business as well. Like, you have to be able to refuse to accept that how it is how it has to be.
You're refusing status quo.
Yes. Yeah. And so refusal underlies deconstruction and imagination. And the third pillar, of course, is going to be action. Can you take action on the things that you have imagined? And it's the difference between, to be really honest, and this is something that I try to be honest with everybody about, transparent about. It can be painful to imagine what could be when you still
And we
live in
don't
what
want
is.
change.
Well, yeah, in two different ways, right? Like, not only is it painful to imagine what could be because now we have to change, but it can be painful to imagine what could be because we're like, this is not good enough and I'm still stuck here.
Right.
You know, the ways that we might imagine a better world, you know, a world where nobody's hungry tonight when they go to bed. You know, like, it can be painful to truly imagine that because we have to live in the disjunction of like, well, that's not the world I have now. And these things can be real sources of grief, can be real sources of rage. And so it can be very painful. And so sometimes people get stuck at the imagination phase because they're like, I can imagine it, but I don't believe that it's actually possible to do anything about it, or I don't believe that I can do anything about it. Or maybe there's a literal structural barrier of like, I do imagine a better world, but given the way that my position in society or whatever, I can't do anything.
Or
about
your
it.
company doesn't have the resources to do that, or
Right.
you know, whatever it is.
Yes, and so a part of the creative mindset as well is figuring out what kinds of action can we take here, and sometimes it looks really different than people expect. It's not, like I said, it's not like waving a magic wand and everything changes to what exactly you want it to be, but it's, you know, can I identify action steps that would take me toward the thing I'm trying to create? And again, there's analogs and creative practices where, you know, somebody who wants to paint an incredibly intricate portrait might be doing that over the course of hours or days or weeks, but they have to start someplace. They have to start with and sometimes that's starting way back at their training, or somebody shows them how to use a paintbrush in a certain way, you know? But there's always some kind of action that we can take. And the reason that's part of the creative mindset is that it takes a creative person not only to kind of recognize that reality could be different, not only to imagine how else it could be, but to imagine that, you know, there's something that we can do about it. Otherwise, we just get stuck in a kind of despair.
How important, not important, negative? I mean, I'm not sure what the answer to this is, of recognizing your own limitations. And I'm thinking painting is a great example. I have a friend who every day she posts a new watercolor that she has done on Facebook, and she is unbelievably talented. I mean, aside from anything else, you look at it and you know what it is, right? Yeah, I have trouble with paint by number, but you know, but I don't, you know, I don't want to be that artist, but my limitation is that is not what I'm to do. So how is, you know, is it important to think, okay, well, I can't do that, but I can do this?
Oh, absolutely. I think that the more common problem is that people think they have more limitations than they have. I mean, certainly
I
other
can't
people
do that, and that's as far as they go.
Right. Yeah, I think certainly for some listeners, I'm sure in your audience, they are dealing with people who have who need to get more self-aware about their limitations and not be trying to take on the entire world or boil the ocean or things like that. I certainly run into that as well. But in my work, a more common problem.
Focus, honey. Pick one.
Yes. In my work, the more common problem that I see and that I'm trying to address is that people see limitations that aren't actually there. And that's not meant to diminish their perception or to be like they're silly or whatever. It's more that like they, in some cases, have literally been trained to see a limitation.
Right.
It's part of the premises.
Right.
That I was
Their parents, their teachers, their whoever said you can't do that.
Yes. Or, you know, their conception of like the industry that they're in, what they'd be like, oh, Tasha, what you're talking about doesn't fit this industry. And I'd be like, well, not until now. But it, you know, but there's nothing, that's part of the deconstruction thing. There's nothing saying that the way that it has worked is the way that it must work. But if you think that that's true, then you're going to keep running into that wall. And that's why I often use that metaphor of stories. Like people hit the wall of their story about themselves or what they do and think that they've hit the wall of reality. And so they are scrambling, like, how do I deal with this wall? And that's an important skill in itself, to be like, okay, I have hit an actual limitation. What's another path that I can take? But then another skill on top of that is like, is it a wall? You know, in what ways?
Can they put in a door?
Yeah. Would it be a wall to everybody who hit the same
Right.
who hit the same thing? Are there other industries or disciplines that have hit a similar point, but because they're coming at it from a different angle, they're seeing a window that I can't see? And And I'm using metaphorical language a lot because people's problems and their walls are so different from one another.
But we understand that concept.
Yes. Yeah. And so, yes, definitely to your point, people being able to recognize maybe I have a limitation here. That doesn't have to mean that I can't do anything. What is it that I could do? And then also being able to question, why do I think this is a limitation? In what ways is it a limitation? And in what ways have I maybe pigeonholed myself or pigeonholed the work that I'm trying to do?
Right. Yeah. I mean, just because when you were 6 years old, somebody told you can't do that, does it really mean you can't do that? And I mean, to me, one of the biggest examples of all of that is something that just happened, the Olympics, right? And not the Olympics, the handicap Olympics. Watching those athletes, most people would have curled up and not done anything. And when you see somebody skiing on one leg or doing whatever it is, I mean, they're obviously they're incredible, but somewhere along the line, I'm sure somebody, if not a lot of somebody, said, "Oh, you can't do that." Probably be very well meaning, right? You'll get hurt. And they looked at them and went, "Oh, right." And we can do that in our lives all the time. And now, yeah, we don't want to get hurt, but whether it's actual physical hurt or mental hurt, or all of those things, but it really is okay to kind of go, okay, well, if I can't do it that way, maybe I can do it this way.
Yes, and it's a good reminder for us to think about what are the things that we can be doing as a collective to make it more made possible for individuals to challenge the boundaries or limitations that they're facing, so that it can be, if we're going to think about things like safety or getting hurt, what would make it more possible for people to take a risk,
Right.
Whatever that risk might look like for them, whether it's a risk of social rejection when they want to reach out to somebody, or a risk associated with trying a new physical feat, or a risk associated with a business venture. What would have to be in place structurally and systemically for us to be able to accommodate those people pushing beyond existing limits and what we know is safe and what we know works, not in an irresponsible way and not just like willy-nilly, like, oh, they want everybody to be out there taking risks, but in the way that that cultivates our humanity and our growth, our innovation, our connection, our ability to create a better world. It's not always, of course, it's not always just individual behavior changes and individual mindsets. It's also how do we use our mindsets to create a system and a structure that is as conducive as possible to human thriving? That's really the biggest goal.
Right. And you mentioned something and it piqued my interest. The concept of team, right? The collective. Back to the sports analogy. Somebody playing tennis, that's a single sport or, individual sport. But they've got coaches. They've got, all the people that are around them. And in a business, we don't have to be by ourselves. In fact, most of the time, it works better if we do have a team. And so how do you really start fostering that to get the best out of each person that's participating?
A beautiful question, and it looks so different across different workplaces and industries, just depending on what it is that people are really doing. Like in some situations, of course, some people might need to be like have solitude and just like hunker down and do some really good work. But even people who really prefer that, my fellow autistic people, like sometimes really love the isolated deep dive work.
Right.
But even we would also need time with other people to nurture our expertise or specialties, to be able to have the social connection that we seek, which is all just to say that this can be so specific and so personalized, but it's also far more possible than people tend to think that it is. And this is where creativity can come into play. And a lot of things, I was just talking with somebody who's developing some support tools for people to create more social connection, kind of like combating the loneliness epidemic that we know is very real in the US. And they were thinking about like, okay, how do we help people to maybe if their habit is to come home from work and just get on the couch, how do we help them to maybe make the behavioral change? This is what they were asking me about. How do we make the behavioral change to instead of going into the couch, they're going out to some place and like meeting their friend? And I was like, okay, back up. Do they have a friend? all of your tools are sort of built to support people who have friends but just aren't getting together with them.
that basis.
Yeah, and so I think that in the workplace as well, you can back up to say, okay, are we having meetings because we just feel like it's important for people to have, there's a lot of workplaces that heard that social connection is important, and so they tried to bring everybody back to the office, and it's sort of like, oh, you're making an assumption here that the most important, that people's social connections need to be at their workplace, or that that's the best place for them to get those connections.
Right.
And that may or may not be true. And if it's not true, that's okay. That can still be good news for you as the workplace, because you can find other ways to draw people out. And even if people are making really robust connections with quote unquote teams in their lives, and it's not even their workplace teams, that's going to only benefit you in your workplace. And I think that's the factor that we often miss. That's really exciting for me to work with leaders on is how can we think differently about how you're supporting your teams and your individuals, not only when they're here, but in the rest of their life, because what they're doing out there is going to have an effect on what they're doing here.
Right. Yeah. And recognizing that you can't force them on a lot of things. I mean, like, I remember when I worked for companies who said, now you will come and play softball. I'm like, no. For one thing, you'd want me to play for the other team. But, so many times companies, bosses, whatever, they don't try to really find and work with people. I flew over the weekend and actually had no problem with security. I don't know what the heck was going on, but in one and I had I had several changes, and I am one of those people, I like to get there early so that I can sit and go right. And so I was kind of off by myself, and one of the young, do they call them sky caps? We were wondering that. He was the people who helps people in the airport. So he wasn't he was an employee of the airport as opposed to an employee of an airline. Anyhow, he was clearly on the autism spectrum. He had headphones. Happiest kid. I mean, he's just bebopping along and all this. Well, he sees me off by myself, and he zeroes in on me. And I thought, okay. I mean, I could put my head in my book, and I was like, I put my book down, and and he and I watched cartoons. And, he had it on his phone, and he had something, and I could see his coworkers smiling at me, right? They were glad that I had taken the time. I could see other people making the ooh face, right? But I kept thinking, this young man has been given purpose. And his employer, the airport or whoever, went out of their way to find a way to give him that purpose. They could have easily said, we're sorry, you're not going to fit in here. And instead they found a way for him to fit in. And I think, we all need to remember that. And, whatever someone's challenges may be, positive and negative, we need to find a way to use those to the benefit of the organization, nonprofit, business, whatever it is.
And there's, and at the same time, recognizing that sometimes the best way to help people find purpose is to make sure that there's a supportive environment around the workplace for them to find that. I was recently in a conversation with somebody who was talking about wanting to cultivate people's sense of purpose and meaning in the workplace. And I was like, that's a beautiful idea. Love it. But also keep in mind that people can find purpose and meaning in lots of different things in their lives. And if you're genuinely worried that that person who works for you lacks a sense of meaning overall, like in their life overall, but you are maybe paying them so little that they've got to work 3 jobs, or
they're just exhausted.
Yeah, they're putting in 80 hours a week here. They can't go be part of a social community.
Right.
They can't be part of being an advocate for things they care about, or a faith community, or whatever it might be for them that gives them a sense of meaning and purpose in their life. And so part of being leaders who are really on top of at the edge of how do we innovate around well-being is both, yes, make sure that the work that you're asking people to do can in some way feel meaningful to them. I just published an article about, it's called Reality-Based Leadership, but it's basically about the idea that what people have going on in their lives, what's going on socio-historically, et cetera, is having an effect on your business, whether you talk about it there and whether you address it there directly or not. And so how can we be reality-based in our work. And part of what I said in that is that no amount of well-being innovation is going to make up for the sense that what you're doing at work is either meaningless or harmful.
Mhm.
And so, yes, please do cultivate a sense of meaning within the workplace. Like, is what people are doing, does it actually matter? And certainly, can people confidently say, oh, the thing that I'm part of doing here at this workplace, is it truly doing no harm to our planet, to the human race, et cetera? Can you focus enough to make sure that that's a part of what people gain from working with you? And also, in addition to that, you can also, I think there's a little bit of creative humility here of like, okay, maybe working for my company isn't the thing that's going to make somebody feel like they're glad that they're alive.
Right.
Do they have space in their lives? Am I supportive of their space in their lives to find what it is that would make them glad to be alive?
Right.
And that's something that collectively we're all doing together and trying to support together.
Right. And we need, I think our souls need that sense of contributing and of purpose. And I think when we don't have that, we have issues. And I know one of the projects that you do a lot of work with is something called Project Uncaged. So tell us a little bit more about that.
Oh, Project Uncaged is a trauma-informed creative writing program that I founded many years ago, working with incarcerated girls. And not something that I had ever imagined myself doing, but I was invited to be a writer in residence at a youth detention facility. And by the time I left that experience, I was like, that is maybe the coolest way I've ever spent my time. And just saw similar things in that program that I had seen other places, as far as young people sharing things in their poems and songs that they had literally never shared elsewhere. But then also, for my scientific brain, a lot of the things that they were sharing in their poems and songs were crucial to our ability to support them as a society. Like, where do they have to go after this? What are they dealing with? What are their barriers to success?
It's like you were saying at the very start. They might not be able to tell someone they had been sexually assaulted, but they can sing about it, or they can write a poem about it. And so, yeah, I mean, that's just.
And often like allude to it. Some of the reasons we know from the science that art can be helpful to people is that you can say something without saying it.
Right.
And that can feel like it can feel safer. You can kind of also retain ownership of maybe some details that feel too private to share, but you're still conveying that you've been through something that you need support for. And so again, it was one of those experiences that made me be like, oh, we have to be paying more attention to how people, I mentioned earlier that we evolved to make and share art for a reason. And one of the main reasons that I've seen in my research that keeps coming up in my work is we needed to expand our capacity for communication. There's a reason why people dance at a wedding instead of just standing there and saying, good job. Like we dance to express something. We jump up and down when we're excited, right? We might bend over when we're sad. We might need to listen to music again. There are things that we do that expand our ability to communicate. And what I've seen in Project Uncaged, what I've seen with my clients now, oftentimes when people cannot have a conversation the way that you and I are in this very linear way, they assume that something is wrong with them. Oh, if I'm having a really difficult experience, maybe with a family member, and I can't just talk about it openly, then I need to figure out how to get over that. Maybe I need to.
Yeah, that's my fault.
Yeah. There's some kind of deficiency here. Why can't I just wrangle things and like say it in this straightforward way?
And they're going to say, because so-and-so did. Right. They compare themselves. And frequently what they're doing is they're comparing themselves to a TV character or something. Well, I'm sorry. It's TV.
Or they've seen that somebody wrote a book about their similar experience, but that person might have taken 10 years to get that book written, And oftentimes what I'm saying is that like we literally evolved to make these other tools to communicate, and they are not inferior tools. These are well-evolved tools that like when you're feeling when you're experiencing something about the human experience that is bigger than what you can put into linear conversation, that is not an indication that something has gone wrong. I mean, it could technically be if you really need to convey information in a specific way, but you can also get support and help for that. But oftentimes the arts can be a way to expand communication. That's what I was looking at with Project Uncaged, but then also that really led to a lot of my dissertation research around what is it that we learn from people when we ask them questions in creative, arts-based ways, when we allow them to answer questions in creative and arts-based ways. And extending from my work in Project Uncaged, what I found in my dissertation research was that, people, we learned, I think it was 50% more about the topic that we were investigating, which was mental health and violence exposure among young women. We learned 50% more from their creative writing than we did from the surveys that were administered. The primary concern that came up from young women about their experiences wasn't represented in the surveys at all. And so there was just this proof that there are things that don't get communicated when we squeeze life into some kind of like linear, like, oh, everything that we talk about needs to be able to be codified or like examined in this one specific way. And that has translated into so many aspects of the work that I do now. Again, it's not always about getting people to be creative or creative expression or talking about art or design or things like that. But it is often about saying, what are we not seeing here? What are the reasons that we're not seeing it? James Baldwin said, the artist, he talked about how everybody has to kind of take some things for granted. Like, the city's going to operate this way, policies get passed this way. Like, people have to take things for granted in order to run your business. He said, the artist cannot and must not take anything for granted, but must drive to the heart of every answer and expose the question the answer hides.
Wow.
And I have always, from the first moment I read that, I was like, oh, that is the call. And I don't think it's just for artists. I think that's part of the creative mindset is, can you look at the answers that you have been given or that you have given other people, and can you recognize that fundamentally, inevitably, these answers are hiding questions that could lead us, and that's not a threat. The questions could lead us to something, I mean, I guess it could, but the questions can lead us to something far better than what we have right now.
Right.
And in Project Uncaged and otherwise, we saw, that standard research methods were often hiding questions and needs that we were missing. And the standard operating procedures for various businesses and standard like industry norms and things like that are often hiding opportunities, but we have to learn to look at it differently.
Right. And we also have to recognize that someone's behavior is an expression of creativity. And I'm not, yes, there's, graffiti, would be a great example of that, but just acting out, singing, dancing, like you said, all of that, that is you're not able to say in words, or you don't want to say in words. And so your behavior is an expression of that creativity.
Absolutely. I have to talk about, I do trainings in mental health and trauma-informed practice every now and then. And I often talk about how we tend to operate as if we have like you're allowed to have 3 robot settings. There's 3 robot settings that are acceptable, especially in professional environments. Like, you can be mildly upset, you can be fine/neutral, or you can be mildly happy. Those are your 3 options.
Can't be any extreme.
Yes. In any direction, you're going to be seen as unprofessional or like too much. But the thing is that like those 3 robot settings are not in any way connected to like the reality of the human experience. They are not scientific. These are just cultural norms. And to be really honest, psychologically and otherwise, our attempts to squeeze our experience into those 3 robot settings does us real harm. It takes a lot of focus for us to do that. People oftentimes in business settings, one thing that we don't talk about very much is like the sheer effort to not be off of that scale of the 3 robot settings. Is it self-stealing our cognitive energy and our focus, productivity, innovation, et cetera? But I think that people can't imagine what it would mean or look like to not require those 3 robot settings. And so they just keep requiring them.
Right, because it's easier to deal with.
It is for every, until it's not,
Right.
It's affecting your bottom line. It's affecting, how you're able to connect with clients, connect with other people in the industry. It's affecting what you're able to imagine. And of course, it's a kind of, it's all illusory. It's a show. It's not authentic. And so my encouragement related to that would be, yes, people's behavior can be an expression of who they are. And also there are ways that we can learn to make room for something beyond the 3 robot settings without the world crumbling.
Right.
There's a way that your workplace culture can support that as well.
Right. And so somebody laughs a little much. Okay. And it's funny because the what we think of as the positive, if that's an extreme, but that also could be a negative. I mean, like, maybe their output of anger is to laugh, or whatever. And unfortunately, what we see is, workplace violence, where they just bottled it up too long. And whether it's problems at home, problems at the office, all of the above, because they weren't able to express it. And, it's funny. One of the places that I worked, we had a health club, and the CEO routinely went and played racquetball. Now, he was a demon when he played racquetball, but he was getting out a lot of that. And then he was fine. And other people, they're going to jog, they're going to, do whatever. But yeah, it's when we say, oh, no, 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 you can't do that, that it just kind of, at some point, it's going to come out.
Yes, and it's a beautiful reminder that there are things that we can be doing collectively and structurally to make more space for that as well.
Right.
That, there are people that it might be indicated for them to rein themselves in at work. Maybe these are folks that they want to work with, but don't necessarily trust or want to trust, and that's an individual choice for people to make. But as long as they have some place in their life, like you said, that somebody could go play racquetball, like if they have some person in their life that they can open up to, some place in their life where they can really let loose, that's really what's going to matter. And sometimes, workplace leaders will think of that and mean like, okay, well then I don't have to provide it because they can go find it. But it's like, no, part of what your workplace can be doing in the structure of our society is how can you build your policies and your expectations and your workplace culture and stuff like that, so that you are part of the fabric of structures and opportunities that people have in their lives in order to be as well as they can be, so that when they come and they work with you, they can give as much as they are able to.
Right. And you should not be the boss, the owner, the supervisor, the whoever who says, I don't care what you do outside of work. Now, you don't need to know every single detail, right? But there, you still need to kind of know, are you having trouble paying your rent? Oh my gosh, you're going to have another baby. Whatever it is, it's okay to care about, outside the workplace.
Yeah, and to care about what are the policies and opportunities in place for people, so that if you have an employee who was going to have a baby, maybe you don't personally know that, but you have invested in creating as much opportunity and support for members of your community in general, writ large, members of society writ large, that when they are new moms, they have resources, right? There's ways that we can pour into that even if I hope that I'm sure that most listeners of your show are not just committed to the bottom line to the exception of anything else, but even folks who are just about the bottom line can see ways in which creating more well-being opportunities for humans, more ways for humans to live their full human experience and not just some slice of it, that's always going to come back to the benefit of your work as well.
Oh my God, I have so many more questions, but we are at the top of the hour. And so for someone who says, Dr. Tasha, we need to have you come to our business, how do they find you? And yes, we will have links in the show notes, but how do they find you and what are the services that you provide?
Oh, thank you, Deb. That's so nice. You can find me. We have made a custom URL for listeners of this show. It's tashagolden.com/powerhour. So if you can remember my name, Tasha Golden, and you can remember this show, then you can find me, tashagolden.com/powerhour. And you can find out there about consulting or one-on-one coaching or speaking and things like that. Would love to help people be more creative in their work and see their work in new ways.
I love it. And like we said, this raises everything. This is not fluff. This is not a waste of time. This really is going to benefit. It's going to benefit your bottom line. And for people who are saying, ugh, that's what you want, right? But when you have happier employees, clients, whatever, everything just rises. And so that's what we want to do. Well, Dr. Golden, this has been so much fun, Tasha. And so, do you have any final thoughts that you want to leave everyone with?
Oh, I think it would be some of what I research when it comes to aesthetics and creative thinking. People sometimes find it because they're trying to be really intentional around, like, oh, how do we design our spaces, or how do we look at our culture, how do we develop our mindsets, things like that. And what I often remind people of is that these things are having an effect whether you're intentional about it or not. A workplace that hasn't been intentionally designed for focus and productivity is still having an effect on people. It's just maybe a negative effect. It's maybe an unintentional effect. And so what I would encourage people to think about is like, okay, you don't have to be like, oh, I'm super excited about becoming more creative or investigating how arts and creativity can affect my well-being. But it's like, oh, something about this is already affecting your life. And if you can open the door to a little bit of curiosity around how might this be affecting me without my being intentional about it? And how might I get intentional about it? That's where a lot of opportunity lies.
Oh, such wise words. And I love ending our program with those. I am Deb Creer. I've been having an absolutely wonderful discussion with Dr. Tasha Golden. And until next time, everyone have a great day.
Tune in for our next program for even more trends, best practices, and techniques for how to make your business a success. The Business Power Hour, hosted by Deb Creer, is proud to be part of the C-Suite Network.